A 90% clean grid is possible. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Welcome to SolarWorks for Illinois. Today we're going to be diving into the 2035 report that was published by Berkeley University, GridLab, and Energy Innovation back in June. And my guest today is Julian Spector, staff writer at GreentTech Media. Welcome to the show, Julian.
Hey, it's great to be here. It's my first live video podcast experience. So,
well, wonderful. Hopefully
yeah.
not your last. Hopefully we don't scare you away.
No, it's good. Just seeing human faces is a rare thing these days. So glad to be here.
So for our listeners, we do these live pre-registered events on a monthly basis, but we've really started to crank out interviews on a weekly basis. And so I want to highlight, of course, our upcoming events for pre-registered. In August, we have Will Kenworthy with Vote Solar coming on to talk about advancing the Midwest clean energy economy. That's August 25th. So we usually do the pre-registered ones on the last Tuesday of the month. And then in September, I don't have this posted yet, but we have Fronius, the inverter manufacturer, coming on the show to talk about rapid shutdown. And then I want to highlight our YouTube channel, because that's where you can find most of our content now, because we are publishing so much. Much of it doesn't make it to the website yet, but check us out on YouTube and please subscribe to that. Give us a thumbs up and tell your friends. We want more people to know about the energy transition. And so without further ado, let's dive into the 2035 report, Julian. This feels like a tipping point to me, has really been crossed, that some very smart people spent a year looking at our grid infrastructure, the cost of upgrading that infrastructure to a 90% clean grid. And they explicitly set the goal, okay, what would it take to get to a 90% clean grid by 2035? And then they kind of work backwards from that and looking at different regions. Of course, in some regions of the US, there's more wind resources. In some regions, there's more solar resources. And then how do we make wind and solar reliable and available and resilient? And the answer to that is with battery storage. So, and you've covered this story at GreentTech Media, but give us a real high level overview from your perspective. Why is this an important report?
Yeah, well, first I'd situate it in the storyline of deep decarbonization studies that over the last several years now, there's been a series of, can we get to 100% renewable by 2050? Can we do, 100% carbon free by some other date? And then, we've seen states go ahead and pass laws requiring that kind of thing. Hawaii's is renewables only. California was carbon free. And I think more of the states have been going just, no carbon emissions from the power system. So there's this growing consensus that we should be shooting for very high goals here. And then this study was a little bit different by picking the 90%, but pulling the timeline forward. So 2035, a lot sooner than I think the conversation was saying, we could do this. But what's interesting is closing the gap of that last 10% can be very tricky, especially if we don't have long duration storage or we don't have some of these technologies that are zero emission and completely dispatchable for the times where there's very little wind and solar. So they kind of solve that by saying, we can still keep a little bit of gas capacity online, but it's really only going to operate in those extreme peak events. And then, for the vast majority of the year, we don't need it. And it's just a very, very low emission grid. And not only that it's going to be slightly cheaper than the power system costs us today. And that was a huge breakthrough, is they We're seeing how the cost declines were beating all the expert expectations of the cost declines, including their own. And so they wanted to rerun the numbers and say, like, okay, with our best understanding of how cheap batteries and solar panels are getting, like, how much further can we push? And I think even the researchers were surprised at just how far they could go.
Yeah, I think this has to do with the phenomenon that we're very bad at predicting what we can achieve in 1 year. We tend to overestimate what we can achieve in 1 year, but we tend to underestimate what we can do in 10 years. And so the price of solar has been falling by 90% in the last 10 years. That has caught so many people off guard. And that, of course, is driving major adoption. And then we have all this aged infrastructure, a lot of it coal plants. These coal plants are 40, 50, 60 years old. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine that replacing a coal plant with a wind farm and a solar farm is going to be cheaper. That's just the bottom line, right? You can get a solar farm for 3 cents a kWh. You cannot buy coal power for 3 cents. And so if you're a large asset owner, you don't want to own expensive assets. It's just not a good business decision anymore. And you see the utilities making these major transitions now and setting goals to transition to wind, solar, and storage away from fossil technologies. And I'm glad you mentioned the carbon thing at the beginning. This does include maintaining some nuclear and some natural gas. We already have that infrastructure installed. We're not saying tear that out. We're saying let's keep that and, rely on those peaker plants, those gas peaker plants. They are expensive, but they're nice to have. When you have peak events, you want to have that extra generation.
Mm-hmm. And then the corollary is that you can shut down the coal plants and you can also stop building new gas plants and just kind of hold on to some of the infrastructure that's already built. Because I think looking ahead, one of the maybe battlegrounds in grid policy now is going to be, do utilities get to keep building new gas plants if we're headed for this kind of phase out? And many of them are now committed to eventually getting rid of carbon emissions. But it's that interim, like, can I get some money into the rate base on a new peaker for the next 15 years? And this study is saying, we don't really need that from a kind of nationwide perspective.
Absolutely. So here is the 2035 report landing page. They have a beautiful website, 2035report.com. And right here, key findings: moving away from fossil fuels, plummeting renewable energy costs, building a renewable energy future, jobs in the economy, health and environment, and policy requirements. It's interesting. A do-nothing approach only gets us to about 55% clean grid by 2035, right? If we just do the status quo. And so we are definitely not going to decarbonize the economy. We're not going to even decarbonize the grid. And that, of course, is a disaster for future generations. And we need to be cognizant of that our children and our children's children are inheriting climate chaos, which is extremely costly and hazardous. So why not, if that's avoidable, why not do it? And what this report shows is that if you set goals like a national renewable portfolio standard, I don't know if they call it, do they call it a renewable portfolio standard, Julian?
I think it might be just clean energy standard or zero emission standard. Yeah. But yeah, basically saying, we need to push the generation mix into a, cleaner direction.
As we've seen, right, around the country, it's those states that get RPSs where the action happens, because then you build a policy infrastructure to incentivize the adoption of new technologies, and away we go. We have that going on in Illinois. We're adding 3,000 megawatts of solar here in the next couple of years, going from 200 megawatts. And so we're going 0 to 60 because of legislation called FEJA, Future Energy Jobs Act, that is to fulfill our renewable portfolio standard. Now, in reality, it's falling short, but it's still been an awesome growth period. Here at Continental, we went from 17 megawatts last year to 30 plus megawatts of installations this year.
Wow.
So it's eye-popping growth for installers.
It's even with all the disruption of your doubling.
You mean the COVID disruption?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, luckily, electrical workers are considered essential workers. And so there was very little slowdown. There definitely has been a slowdown of some of the construction work that our construction partner, Continental Electrical, does. But as a solar installer, Continental Energy Solutions, we're going full guns. Now, next year's another matter because we're having a funding cliff in Illinois. And so all of the installers and developers are having to make contingency plans. You can't bank on the Illinois market right now. There is new legislation in the works. The Path to 100 is the industry solution, which augments the RPS and gets us to, I think, 40% by 2040. But anyway, I don't want to digress too much.
Well, actually, I had a thought on you mentioned the policy need, and I think that is really important to emphasize that there's this funny thing of if the grid moves to this 90% clean, it will be cheaper. They measure that in wholesale prices of like 13% lower cost. And I should flag that, there's other things that go into a customer bill at the end of the day in terms of, wires upgrades and the cost. So, it's possible that it's cheaper at the wholesale level and individual retail customers might not necessarily feel that. But the point being, this transition is actually cheaper in contrast to a lot of the naysayers, say it's going to be wildly expensive. There's some talking points that kind of going in a clean direction would amount to extending the coronavirus recession was something that some of the GOP
I haven't heard that particular rumor or myth.
Yeah, the argument being, you can't possibly do clean energy without it being wildly expensive. This study shows actually that's not the case. It's going to be cheaper, but the market structures we have are actually not sufficient to pick the cheapest option. And there's just so many. One, just the fragmentation of each state having its own separate energy policy, and then even where you do have competitive markets, the way the rules are written has a huge impact on what resources can actually compete. We're seeing like PJM wanting storage if it can provide capacity, it has to have 10 hours of duration, which nobody's really building storage at that kind of duration right now. And different barriers like that where the rules are written for the previous generation of technology. So Energy Innovation did this companion study about the necessary policy apparatus to support that. And really the big one is just a national standard to say we're moving in this direction, and kind of align all the other states and policymaking towards that goal. But some other interesting things about like securitizing coal plants so that they can retire. Like you're going to have this problem of you need the coal plants to retire, but communities and companies have some vested interest in keeping them going as long as possible because of the economic benefits they get. And so finding ways to like put some money together to infuse that into the community and kind of make people whole so that they don't have an incentive to just kind of stick it out as long as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that in our education system, we don't really drive home how decentralized government is in the United States. Every state and every county, sometimes within a state, in Illinois, we have 100 counties.
Hmm.
And if you're a solar developer, you're dealing with the county authorities on the rules and regulations, and sometimes the city even, and every county is different. So that complicates life tremendously. But anyway, so let's talk about what is the great end result of this, of a clean grid in 2035. I'm going to show the Data Explorer here in a second.
Yeah, that's
but
visual up there.
yeah, what is the role of wind, solar, and storage in a clean grid economy?
Mm-hmm. So we can see the different. So you can see how the wind and solar just kind of mushroom out there, and become really the bulwark of the energy system. This scenario keeps the nuclear plants that are here. I think it's envisioning it's going to be very hard to build anything new. So that's kind of a steady little bit there.
Yep.
And then it's what's the
same with hydro. So
yeah,
nuclear
same
is
with
the
hydro.
light blue. Hydro is the aqua blue. You see coal in the dark blue shrinking and disappearing entirely,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're phasing coal out. Hydro stays. Geothermal, going to continue to be a small percentage. And then the big guns are wind, major expansion, and solar. It's like 1,000 gigawatts, all said, right, of wind, solar, and maybe storage. I don't know. Where's storage in the mix?
Yeah, so I think it's not included in this graph because of this generation, and so the storage will be, storing the stuff from the generators. Yeah, I think the storage is going to be playing that crucial role of like covering the gaps between the wind and the solar. And I should back up and say one of the principles of this scenario is that wind and solar get so cheap that the kind of competitive landscape of where they make sense is going to be more or less the entire country, as opposed to some older scenarios where you are kept to the pockets that are super super sunny and super super windy. What this modeling found was actually once they get cheap enough, you can kind of put them all over, and they'll be better in some places, but still like cost effective in just a very very wide swath of the country. And what follows from that is you don't need to invest in as much of the really big multi-state transmission infrastructure that's been modeled in the past and considered to be kind of necessary for a highly renewable grid. And here they're saying it's much more about like intrastate, like with just sort of local or regional transmission to get from the plants to the nearby cities. But it's moving away from this concept of like all the solar's in the Southwest, and then we have to ship it 1,000 miles to other cities, which gets very expensive and also difficult to site. But yeah, so
it's inefficient too, right? There's tremendous line losses. I think upwards of 40% of the energy is lost if you're wheeling power over long distances, unless you're doing HVDC, which the US is only dabbling in. China's truly building an HVDC grid that's high voltage DC, which is more efficient. I don't know what the line losses are for long distance HVDC, but we are going after that. And I don't know if they address that at all in this study. I haven't heard anything about HVDC in this, but anyway, the solar resources, and for that matter, the wind resources throughout the US are very robust. Obviously, the wind resources are spottier, and some places like the Great Plains and the upper Midwest have great resources. Texas has great resources. We have plenty of offshore resources, obviously. I mean, that's why you see wind being such a dominant source. I mean, it's almost like 2/3 wind, 1/3 solar. It looks like to me. But in any case, people say to me, "Well, Tim, do we get enough sunlight here in the upper Midwest?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, we do, absolutely." And Germany is one of the most solarized countries, and they're up in Canada latitude-wise. We forget how far northern Europe is, and solar works up north. You have to tip the panels towards the sun, so you tip them steeper at a higher angle. But
and even Canada's getting into solar. In Alberta, there's some big new projects going in.
There's a lot of manufacturing in Canada as well. A lot of racking companies are based in Canada.
Yeah, and we should say this is still a big lift, like a big acceleration in terms of output relative to historic installation levels, but it's actually not. It's not as big as I might have expected. So, they're saying that, it would have to be about 1,100 gigawatts of new wind and solar in the next 15 years. And then that's roughly 70 gigawatts per year. So that is roughly triple the best kind of annual solar output or installation and annual wind installation from a single year. But that doesn't feel impossible, especially given that the industries have just been kind of scaling up and,
if you can install 14 gigawatts of solar, which is our average now annual, I think it peaked at 16 one year when the ITC was going to phase out in 2016. But if you can install 14 gigawatts, you can install 30 gigawatts, and that's what it takes. 70 gigawatts of wind and solar per year for 15 years. You do that math, it's 1,050 gigawatts. Mark asks, is this chart forecast only about what is technically possible from a grid and baseload standpoint, or a deployment forecast? My response to that, and I'll see what you think, Julian, is that it's both. It's, they basically set a goal, Mark, and said, how do we get to a 90% clean grid based on current technology, the cost of technology, and then what we understand of the availability of wind and solar resources, so to speak, in different regions, right? What do you think, Julian?
Yeah. Well, I would just clarify that it's not a business. The graph we just showed, not a business as usual projection of what's going to happen right now, but it's sort of, if you set these parameters of trying to get to this goal by 2035. And then follow up with the necessary policies to align the states and push in that direction, then you would end up in there. But yeah, I think a base case projection, there's a lot more, there's a lot of barriers to actually closing the coal plants, and a lot of utilities are trying to build extra gas in the next few years. So this isn't necessarily what the future looks like, but it is if you, produce the right policies and work towards that goal.
And the big kahuna there is that there's a federal clean electricity standard, right, to say that we'll reach 55% clean, meaning carbon free, by 2025, 75% by 2030, and 90% by 2035. That was technology agnostic, and then they ran some NREL model. I don't know the name of that model, but basically you put some inputs in, you say, okay, I want to get to 90% clean, and then some other benchmarks, and then you run it, and then it spits out, this is where you should go with wind, this is where you should go with solar.
Yeah, and then also some news since I wrote about this study, and the study came out, the Joe Biden, presidential campaign came out with its climate platform and adopted 2035 as its deadline for actually 100% carbon free. So that was kind of mind blowing to, because it would when the study came out, it's like, wow, 2035, is that doable? Like people are talking about that now. And then you read it and it's like, oh, okay, this sort of checks out. Like doesn't seem as it, everyone had just assumed you can't do anything till 2050, and that's a very long time away. And so the study made 2035 look, within grasp. And then the Joe Biden campaign convened this Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force where they brought together, more progressive climate advisors and allies on the Biden side, and then, people from the Sanders side that, we had AOC and like Sunrise Movement and people like that coming together with John Kerry and, the more Biden camp people, and they came up with 2035 as the clean electricity grid deadline, and then the campaign officially adopted that. So things are moving fast now. It went from being no one really talking about 2035. I think Jay Inslee raised it in his campaign as a deadline, but now it seems like it is the official policy platform of the Democratic presidential campaign. So it's not in the fringe anymore, basically.
That's right. Biden is not a fringe candidate by any stretch. He's a conservative Democrat. And so this gives the report true street cred. And of course, it's critical, right? That humanity really start to get serious about decarbonizing the economy. Anybody who knows anything about climate science, right, and isn't a climate denier, but I mean, the writing is on the wall that humanity, that climate change is an existential threat. And we're totally naive about these tipping points. And, it's ice, water. And so when the sea level rises, it historically, when you look back in the geologic record, it can rise rapidly over decades, not thousands or millions of years. So anyway, I want to talk about some of the other sections specifically. So we've kind of touched on moving away from fossil fuels, the plummeting renewable energy costs, building a renewable energy future, and jobs in the economy. Let's talk about those two things. 1,000 gigawatts of wind and solar is non-trivial. I'm not going to deny it. That's a lot of infrastructure projects, but that means jobs, and that means economic growth. And obviously we are in the midst of an economic meltdown, the Corona economy, I call it. I'd like to call it the Corona recovery economy. I'm not sure that we've seen the worst yet. And there are many people that are, pointing that out, that this could get a lot worse before it gets better. So we need things that are going to be good for the economy, good for people, and good for the longevity of society. What does this report say about jobs?
They definitely say the jobs is going to be a huge component of it. And maybe we could pull up the numbers. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but they crunch the sort of the lost fossil fuel jobs and then the potential gain in clean energy jobs, and find it to be a very positive outcome for the economy.
We're talking 500,000 or 530,000 renewable energy jobs a year.
Whoa. That's a lot.
And so that what that does is that employs all of the workers that are working in the coal industry. These are engineers that are, making these coal plants run. They're laborers that are driving coal from the rail yard to the plant, et cetera, et cetera. We want a just transition. We don't want this to be on the back of low-wage workers at all. And this demonstrates to the contrary, that it will be, there's going to be tons and tons and tons of opportunity across the spectrum, from white collar to blue collar. And so if you're
Yeah.
a young person or thinking of a career change, I've started to be approached by people from the oil and gas industry, right? Which is currently, the oil industry is collapsing, and I truly think that the carbon bubble is now bursting, and oil is the bellwether. So those folks are losing jobs now by the tens of thousands, and so we have a path forward for those workers to get into wind and solar. There's, if you can build an oil platform, boy, building a wind farm or a solar farm is going to be a cakewalk, right?
Yeah.
That's the
Oh,
nice thing,
totally.
is this technology is way less complicated than stuff that we already do. Oil platforms, offshore oil, boy, that's hardcore technology, hardcore complicated engineering and construction and maintenance work. And offshore wind, of course, has shares some analogies there. The Norwegians are going to take this to the bank, right? They're experts at building offshore oil platforms. An offshore oil platform is very similar to an offshore wind platform. Oil is still more complicated, but
Yeah. And there's some interesting ideas on the geothermal side. Geothermal's been a pretty small part of the US grid, but it does involve drilling and, pumping stuff in and out of the ground. And some startups I've spoken with are working on technological breakthroughs that would potentially allow that to scale and employ folks who know, how to use that equipment. There's even some storage companies, like Highview Power is designed this kind of liquid air, like they like cool down air and pump it into tanks and then release the energy, and it spins a turbine and stuff. But it's all based on equipment that's from the oil and gas industry or from the traditional power industry, as a way to bring down cost and technological risk. But I think you'll see more companies like that could offer a pretty clear pipeline from existing fossil fuel skill sets to clean energy economy skill sets. As a reporter, I have some skepticism of I think sometimes the clean jobs narrative is a little too shiny, and we need to flesh it out with some specifics, because it's, you can't just shut down a coal plant in West Virginia and expect that the clean energy jobs will kind of appear. Like, you have to really put some policy work into that and some planning, and but certainly, I think we're shifting, in the national understanding of what's a secure kind of good energy industry. Like you mentioned, the fracking companies have just been falling apart in this recession, and it turns out taking on lots of debt and then not doing profitable business, it makes it hard to be a sustainable business. Who knew? But if we have these solar and wind companies with a really robust growth outlook, I think that'll do some of the work of attracting the talent. And then there's some very hopeful initiatives of trying to fill the gap, like in the Navajo territory. There's the Navajo Generating Station. It was a massive coal plant that served the Southwest and
Four Corners area, yes.
Yeah, and so that shut down, and you could say, oh, great for the environment, no more pollution, no more carbon emissions, but huge impact on the economy of that area. And then there's a new company, Navajo Solar, that's trying to develop massive solar plants within the reservation and utilize the transmission infrastructure left over from that coal plant. But with this whole mission of giving the proceeds back to the community that didn't actually profit as much from previous power plant development. So there are some very cool initiatives that are explicitly looking at how does solar fill this gap. and take
Yeah,
care of
I'm
those
glad you
people.
mentioned the Four Corners. That's a good case in point where you've got that is a very large, it's like a gigawatt or larger. It's a very large coal or several coal plants.
Hmm.
And I happen to grow up in New Mexico, so
Oh, okay.
that plant was being discussed on my kitchen table because my dad is an environmental justice activist and journalist, and so the Navajo Nation has been negatively impacted by the air pollution and the mining pollution from coal, and also from the mining pollution from uranium. There's a lot of uranium on Navajo land, and when you mine uranium, the dust gets in the air and then it gets in your lungs and it causes cancer. But you can take that infrastructure, like you said, those power plants have really ginormous substations right there, and then build solar, wind, and storage. And they're looking at just that, I think, using maybe Lake Powell as a pumped storage facility. And because they have amazing solar resources there in the Southwest, right? This is the desert Southwest,
Mm-hmm.
and so you can absolutely transition a region. I want to address Mark's other question. He says, so if this happens in 2035, can you describe what the utility landscape will look like? Well, I think that's on that. You have to look at that data chart. The main, and then he says, which ones will have disappeared? So the one thing that's going away is coal. And the reason for that, Mark, is because the goal is to decarbonize the grid infrastructure. And that's the only way that you can do that, right? To make that transition, you have to shutter the coal plants. It's just too carbon rich. Gas is also carbon rich, not quite as rich, and it has less SOx and NOx, so it's a cleaner source of energy than coal. But the gas peaker infrastructure is kept in the model for some other reasons, I think.
And I think it's not all of that, but it sounds like, yeah, was he talking about sort of the utility company of like, how does the utility sector change? Which is a really good question. And it kind of puts me in mind of the like ancient sagas of, empires rising and falling and the shifting power. And I guess I think it is possible that we end up here without much change in the landscape of utility companies. Like if they change with it,
if they change with it, right? Yeah, Mark asks, he means specific utilities like ComEd and We Energies.
yeah,
There will be winners and losers. Unfortunately, we still have a utility industry that is quite monopolistic, and
yeah.
so
It's funny. I was just writing about that I do a kind of personal newsletter called Bright Ideas. That's Bright Ideas at Substack or .substack.com, and was just writing about monopolies and how we still tolerate that in utilities, and it doesn't look so good when you have cases like what just went down in Ohio, where it turns out company A allegedly bribed the person who became the Speaker of the House to with like $61 million to then pass a giant bailout for First Energy with its bankrupt nuclear division, and the federal prosecutors, they're saying that was actually they think it's a criminal conspiracy. You're not supposed to pay off politicians to then bail you out and shift money from the public to a profit-seeking company that's not very good at generating profits. So
we have an analogous case here in Illinois.
Yeah,
ComEd was just found guilty and fined $200 million. ComEd is the daughter company of Exelon. Exelon owns and operates a fleet of nuclear power plants here in Illinois.
right.
And our clean power legislation, the one that we're enjoying right now, FEJA, includes $200 million or $230 million per year for 2 nuclear power plants that are uneconomical. Exelon is saying, hey, if you want this grid infrastructure, you have to help us prop this industry up because these plants are too expensive to keep alive. And trust me, they're asking for this again with other parts of their fleet. So, I mean, Illinois is the most nuclearized state in the United States. I think we have 12 operating nuclear power plants. Most Illinoisans don't have any idea about this, but anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's, if I recall correctly, they technically settled before being found guilty, and that prevented it from going to trial and, you know, more juicy details coming out.
Yeah, they did a settlement, and now there's a criminal investigation of Mike Madigan, who is suspected of taking bribes from ComEd. So yeah, we'll see where that goes. It's not good for a whole lot of reasons, but also for the reason that it's a distraction from our initiative to pass new clean energy legislation.
Yeah.
So
and I think to the point of like where's the utility sector headed? So we're seeing with those corruption cases this kind of last gasp approach of just hold on to what you've got, and it's even worse than that because it's, at least in Ohio, it's extract $1 billion from helpless taxpayers and just normal people who don't want this, by kind of circumventing the proper legislative way of doing things. On the other side, there's a bunch of utilities that are very actively building out this future already. And it would go back to Xcel Energy and, Colorado and Minnesota and a bunch of states around there. They committed to the carbon-free future back in 2018, end of 2018. And yes. Then we've seen, it seems like any kind of respectable, forward-thinking utility, even a bunch of the old school, like, Southern companies committed to carbon free, and Duke Energy, and you've got Florida Power and Light building 30 million solar panels by 2030. So I think a lot, and I should add that they're not just doing it because it's, good for the planet. They've also figured out the way the rate basing regulations work. If you can shut down that expensive coal plant with the big operational expense that gets just passed through, and then instead build new wind and solar where you earn the regulated rate of return, you can actually clean up your power, lower the price for customers, and then send more profits to your shareholders. So it's this crazy, wow, that actually is a win-win-win for everybody. And I think that's why you've seen just in the last year or two, some of these very smart utilities with a lot of people to crunch the numbers are just going full speed ahead on the wind and solar and the batteries.
Here in the Midwest, NIPSCO in Northern Indiana has done this. They issued an RFP for 2,800 megawatts or something like that of wind and solar last year. Alliant Energy in Wisconsin has set a goal.
Just committed to 100% carbon free. It's really, it's anyone, it's almost a weekly thing of another utility is gonna get rid of carbon, and
the dominoes are falling,
shutting down. Yeah. So I think in that sense, they, those companies are positioning themselves to be still a vital part of the system in 2035. And it's kind of, I think there's certainly folks in the industry who see the utility as kind of the old, monopolies that they'd love to break free from. But then again, if you do have a utility that's really, pushing ahead on clean energy, that's a good ally to have in terms of they know how to deal with infrastructure, and they know how to run the whole system and keep it reliable. And so I think I think a lot of them actually will be around, and they'll just become the like clean energy providers.
I want to encourage our listeners to ask questions. You can chat those into the chat box or the Q&A. Either one works fine. And we're nearing the end of the podcast. We've got about 10 minutes left. So get your questions in. We'll answer them if we can. And, we would be remiss, Julian, if we didn't mention the health and environmental benefits of this plan, because those are significant as well. And for example, they conclude that by creating a 90% clean grid, we're going to avoid 85,000 premature deaths. Those are mostly from air pollution, so reducing particulates, SOx and NOx, and CO2. And so that's just air pollution kills millions of people globally on an annual basis. I think it's upwards of 4 million people. And so if we can make the air cleaner, create jobs, modernize our infrastructure, and as I like to say, and this is from Elon Musk, we're going to triple the grid when we electrify transportation. Mm-hmm. Transportation is also a major, major source of air pollution, of course, because so much of it runs on fossil fuels today. But the tipping point is near. Probably, by the 2030s, we are going to transition from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles and then autonomous electric vehicles. And, my children's children will never own a car. They will just see transportation as a service. But we need a lot more grid infrastructure. The grid is, as we've seen in California with the fires, right? The grid is a little decrepit, and so we need to modernize the grid and make it more resilient so that we don't have these rolling blackouts because there's a wind event affecting hundreds of thousands of people in swaths of California. You yourself may have witnessed this because you live in the LA area.
Yeah, well, I moved from PG&E territory to LADWP territory right before the really bad power shutoff season last fall that PG&E had. So we've been actually okay. It's sort of LA Basin is fine, and I think there's up in the hills, there's more of a risk there. But yeah, I think the health benefits. I think it is really important to just mention, like, people die from air pollution, and there's actually very robust public health literature measuring the morbidity and mortality that comes from burning coal and from burning gas. And I find that's weirdly left out of a lot of power. We kind of debate the electricity system as if it's this abstract thing, and it's like, if the status quo is actually killing people and you think it's cheaper, like maybe the killing people's bad, like maybe that should be weighed in the trade-offs here. And then looking to the future, if you can actually have cheaper power and not hurt people by polluting the air that they breathe, like that's clearly better. There's the health argument has always been there, and now there's a economic argument as well. But yes, also to the grid resiliency, it's a problem. But California is sort of in some ways modeling the future of this transition, but that the future doesn't look so good if you have to cut off power to like 1 million people because there's a windstorm and your own utility equipment might start a deadly wildfire. So there's a lot of debates going on here about localizing the grid and building sort of pockets of microgrids. But then you run into the storage doesn't last that long. So if you want to stay powered up off grid for like 2 days in a row, the default is gas or diesel generator right now, which then doesn't really help with the climate goals. And so I think that there's a lot of debate there in the short term of like, how do we actually make a grid that's safe for everyone going forward.
I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about storage, and I want to talk about the California grid, because California is the future. California is 10 or 15 years ahead of most parts of the country. When we were talking in the pre-show, I don't know if you remember this, but on a sunny, windy day in California, some majority of power now comes from wind and solar, right? Do you know what that statistic is?
Yeah, I mean, I've just sort of tuned into you can check on the Kaiso app, the grid operator, or on their website. And at a given moment in time, like a sunny day in the spring, I've seen like 80% wind and solar. And I think I've seen people screenshot like 90%, and that's maybe just for a few minutes or even an hour or something. But I was struck by, I think the old way of looking at this was that the grid somehow like break if you ever reached above 50% renewable, or so. There are all these concerned studies of like, how is it, is this even physically possible? And we are seeing like you can in a given moment have like huge amounts of renewable power flowing through all the wires, and it's actually totally fine. And we haven't maintained that 80% or 90% for like a whole day yet, but as a proof of concept, it's like, yeah, okay, we know how to take that and distribute it and make sure everyone has the reliability they need.
Wind and solar are intermittent, but most grid infrastructure is intermittent in some regards. Nuclear power plants aren't 100% on. They have a capacity factor, I think, of like 80%, right? Because they have to be taken down for maintenance and refueling. And wind and solar can be throttled, right, remotely. You can throttle the energy from a solar array with UL 1741 inverters. You can throttle back your wind turbine generation. Just put on the brake. So,
yeah. And then there's some interesting new models of like NextEra's building a few wind solar battery plants, like triple threat kind of plants. And there you're looking at, the solar pattern during the day, and then the wind coming in at night, and then using the battery to like fill in the gaps. And it's maybe not base load per se, but it's getting pretty close in terms of round the clock power.
And on the storage side, I mean, what this report is addressing is lithium ion battery storage. It's 4-hour batteries for the most part, I think, that they're using. So that's existing technology. What we don't have is a 36-hour battery, right? If the wind is still and the sun doesn't shine for some reason, let's say you have really rainy, cloudy weather, or there's a volcano and the earth is covered in ash, then you do need long-term storage, or you need gas peakers and nuclear power. And so, we have to be smart about these things. And there is new storage technology coming on. There's gravity batteries. There's compressed air storage. There's, of course, pumped hydro, there's nothing new about pumped hydro. It's just, there's more exploration, I think, going on for those. Unfortunately, you need very specific geographic characteristics for pumped hydro generally. You need someplace that's high and someplace that's low. And here in the Midwest, those places are few and far between. We do have caverns. Yeah. You can convert, like we have here in Central Illinois, we have natural gas caverns where the gas companies store gas. They just pump it into these caverns.
Right.
You can do the same thing you can use those caverns as compressed air storage facilities. So I do think we will see some of that. And then the gravity battery, I can't remember the name of that company that's promoting this tower. It's got a crane system.
Energy Vault.
Energy Vault. It builds a tower using excess energy, and then it takes the tower apart, unwinding the clock, so to speak. And that's pretty nifty. I don't think it's cost competitive with wind and solar, but anyway, it's coming.
Yeah, there's a lot of creativity, and I've been covering that kind of long duration or lithium ion alternative sector for a while, and there's been a lot of companies that didn't make it, and I think the ones that are still standing after, you know, a decade of kind of fighting it out and getting their laboratory tests, and these are like the survivors. And that doesn't mean that their product is necessarily going to compete with lithium. Lithium's just really cheap relative to very small, bespoke kind of exotic technologies. But, you know, there are a number of very different approaches for that long duration storage that have stood, you know, haven't gone bankrupt yet, basically. And we're going to start seeing those kind of get out. I mean, Form Energy is a good one to watch. They're based in Cambridge, and a lot of MIT talent there. And they won a contract for Great River Energy in Minnesota. That's a 1 megawatt, 150 megawatt hour system. And that's for, I think, delivery in 2023. So it's technically a pilot because it's just 1 megawatt, but it's no one's built, you know, 150 hour duration battery yet. So
yeah, we're going to have to do a show just on emerging technologies for storage, because I think there is a lot of runway there. Well, Julian, unfortunately, we're out of time. I do want to encourage our listeners to check us out on the web. I'm going to show the landing page, cesnrg.com/podcast. You can register for all of our pre-registered events there. We have Will Kenworthy with Vote Solar coming on to talk about advancing the Midwest clean energy economy on August 25th. And then check us out on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel. Please give us a thumbs up, hit that bell, and tell your friends about Solar Works for Illinois. Thank you so much, Julian Spector with GreenTech Media, for joining us today. And I look forward to future conversations.
This is really fun. Glad to talk through it. And thanks for the questions from the audience. Really good stuff there. Yeah, have a good rest of your week.
I'm Tim Montague, your host. Let's grow solar.